Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Ross Sandler, professor of law at New York Law School, and I welcome you to our 135th City Law Breakfast. We've never, thank you, 135. That may be more episodes than Seinfeld. Do you think it is? I don't know. This is an important breakfast. We've never had a breakfast before in the middle of August like this. But the issue is really important, and the opportunity came when Commissioner Bassett, Dr. Bassett, said that she'd be willing to come to a breakfast at this time. And this is, of course, a very propitious moment. So we are delighted that everyone is here. So many of you are here, and we're delighted to have this breakfast here at New York Law School. Let me introduce our Dean and President, Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Ross. And I like having breakfasts like this in August. I'm really happy to greet all of you this morning and to welcome you back to the new academic year City Law Breakfast Series. This is a really big event for us. We just welcomed our 1L class this year, and some LLM students are coming in as well. We have a terrific new class of close to 340 students who've come in, and we're really proud. And many of them are here this morning. I want to welcome them and thank them for coming. So congratulations. And I'm really, really excited to have Commissioner Bassett here. She's someone whose work I've followed for, I think, the better part of 15 years. And she is a tremendous leader and leads one of New York City's most critical agencies, and in effect, really one of the world's leading public health organizations. And it's no small feat to run this multifaceted public health agency, and the breadth and reach of what the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene does cannot be understated, and it's really quite extraordinary. I think today is going to be ever more important because of the timeliness of what's going on nationally with Zika. I know that's going to be a focus of Commissioner Bassett's talk this morning. And it's interesting, Zika has been a big topic of discussion here at the law school. In fact, several of our students are from the Miami area, for example, and where that's a big issue. And some of them are here today. Can our students who are from Miami or close by come? There you go. And and as we say, New York Law School is New York's law school, and it includes Miami because Miami is the 6th borough. So it's quite important. But one of our students, our 2L, Stefano Perez, actually worked for the Florida legislature in their health care appropriations staffing committee. So it's important, and he's got a great interest in public health, so really happy that he's here. So without any further ado, let me ask Ross to come back and give more formal introductions to Commissioner Bassett, and we'll get our program underway. Ross.
Thank you, Dean Crowell. First, let me just, before I do that, I do want to just thank the sponsors of these breakfasts that allow us to continue to do this as many times a year as we do, and without charge. The law firm of Greenberg Traurig, Consolidated Edison, Verizon, and the Gold Star members. Those of you who have a Gold Star on your name tag because you voluntarily contributed to pay for the breakfast. We're delighted for all of that, and we need that kind of support to keep doing this. Now, Dr. Bassett has a wonderful resume and a wonderful many years of experience that brings her to this position. She grew up in Washington Heights, Manhattan, went to Fieldston, Harvard College, received her MD from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, has a master's in public health. She did a residency at Harlem Hospital, and then did her work in Africa, in Zimbabwe, for 17 years on the medical school faculty at the University of Zimbabwe, where she worked on AIDS and AIDS prevention in an area where AIDS was one of the most, had one of its most terrible effects. She worked also with the Rockefeller Foundation, again on AIDS in South Africa, and eventually came back after 17 years to New York City, where she became Deputy Commissioner of the New York Department of Health, where she worked on many of the signature programs of the Bloomberg administration, the smoking ban, the trans fat ban, posting calories in restaurants. After leaving there, she left and then came back in the de Blasio administration as commissioner. And then 9 months after she became commissioner, Craig Spencer shows up in New York with Ebola, and a massive chaotic scene seemed to be emerging. And on October 23, 2014, Spencer is diagnosed, and then Dr. Bassett is on television reassuring the city and the country, and that evening, and then, but what was so amazing is I've never seen an evaluation in the public that was so laudatory. Let me read to you what the New York Times said about Dr. Bassett's reassurance of the city. She said, the Times said, this is on October 25th, just a day and a half after her television appearance. When the cameras blinked on, Dr. Bassett, the New York City Health Commissioner, stood out as a palpable force of calm, delivering potentially hair-raising information with the easy, earthy cadence of a comforting relative. Her message, conveyed in notably plain words, was clear but not clinical, firm but warm. The average New Yorker had nothing to fear from Ebola. That was an amazing performance, and it was very reassuring. I remember it at the time. Now we have perhaps an even more threatening disease, and it is reassuring that someone who's already been tried by fire by Ebola is now taking on the Zika virus. We welcome to this platform Dr. Bassett, Commissioner of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Ross, for that very kind introduction. I feel duty-bound to remind you that the leading causes of death in the city remain smoking, unhealthy diet, and lack of physical activity. But I have had my tenure really marked by a flurry of microbes. But before I turn to the topic for today, I want to thank Dean Crowell and Professor Sandler for inviting me. It's really an honor to deliver the 135th City Law Breakfast. And I usually talk to health professionals and sometimes to general audiences, sometimes to the television audience, but I don't think I've ever really talked to an audience that I think is enriched by lawyers. At least there are quite a few lawyers here, and I'm especially curious to hear what kind of questions you're going to have for me. Now, as the commissioner of a city with 8.5 million people, it won't surprise you that we're a very large health department. We have 6,000 employees, and they address a very broad array of issues that are all relevant to health. The topics that require my focus and attention range from diabetes to HIV to homelessness to the minimum wage to racism to health equity. All of these have a bearing on the health of our population. So it's really hard to summarize what we do in public health. Sometimes we say we work from A to Z, from the air we breathe to zoonoses, and these days that Z most often stands for Zika. So today I'm going to direct most of my remarks to the topic that has been generating increased public concern, the Zika virus. Now, these breakfast meetings, I understand, are a chance for we bureaucrats to convey to all of you more of a sense of transparency, sort of an insider's view, behind the scenes of how we handle issues of pressing public concern. So I'm going to try and continue that tradition this morning and convey to you how much more there is to our Zika response than you can glean from our public service announcements, from the press conferences, or even from our website, which I recommend that all of you visit. It's really very good. I want to start out by making it really clear that I'm confident in our response to Zika here in New York City. And that's not to say that I don't worry. Of course I worry. I'm worried about how to communicate better so that people who should be worried about Zika take the right measures to protect themselves, and that's mainly pregnant women and their partners. And I'm also concerned that people who actually shouldn't worry relax, and maybe even go visit Latin America and the Caribbean. I know also that we're learning a lot about Zika, and much is unclear, particularly the longer-term impacts on babies born to Zika-infected mothers. So for a lot of this information, we're just going to have to wait. It's really been humbling, the spread of Zika, for public health. I suspect, for example, that sexual transmission is not going to be something that we see on a substantial scale, but I'm not sure. So I worry about that. So I have all these concerns, and I'm going to invite you to share some of them with me. But the Hollywood portrayal of an infectious disease, a weird pathogen that appears from a foreign forest and explodes among us, spurring traffic gridlock as people flee the city, heroic doctors wearing space suits, that's not the story that we're talking about today. So I'm going to explain to you some of my details of how I'm confident in our response to Zika. Then I'll go into the uncertainty, and I'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the Zika virus itself. I think many of you know that this is not a new virus. In fact, it was first described in 1947, so that's a ways back, and it was described in Uganda, named after the Zika forest in Uganda. The word Zika has its roots in the Luganda language. It translates to overgrown. And for many years, 6 decades, this virus was confined to the equatorial regions of Africa. It only recently spread to Southeast Asia to establish the Asian branch of the Zika family. And some scientists think that it mutated there, developing some of the odd and scary characteristics that it now has, notably its ability to damage the brains of developing babies. From Southeast Asia, it moved to the Pacific Islands, to the Yap Islands, French Polynesia, and then somehow it jumped to Brazil, first taking hold in the impoverished northeast of that country. So now, as we all know, transmission is ongoing in all of the Caribbean, much of Latin America. Altitude, mosquitoes don't like high altitude, is really what accounts for the sparing of the Andean areas of Latin America. And right now, the only country in Africa that has ongoing Zika transmission is Cape Verde Island, a former Portuguese colony, so it has probably a relationship with Brazil, that is off the coast of West Africa. Now, this pattern of geographic spread mirrors that we've seen with other mosquito-borne viruses like dengue and chikungunya. The researchers who studied the move of Zika from French Polynesia to Brazil, the move that precipitated the current outbreak, think that the virus traveled out of the Pacific to Latin America sometime in 2013 and 2014. Now, this shouldn't surprise us. We have a world that is increasingly globally connected. We have relentless socioeconomic inequalities. We have climate change, which accounts for an expansion of mosquito-friendly climates across locales and across seasons. So get ready. We're going to see more of these kind of outbreaks in the future. And while viruses are a natural feature of our environment, their increased propensity to spread and wreak havoc is not. We can do something about this. From Brazil, Zika has now gone on to affect much of Latin America. And in January, the World Health Organization predicted that it would spread to all countries in the region. It has now, as predicted, spread to the United States, the continental United States. Last night we learned that it has moved beyond the Wentwood, Miami neighborhood and extended now to Miami Beach. This was entirely predicted. Zika is spread by a family of mosquitoes called the Aedes mosquitoes, and particularly by a type of Aedes called Aedes aegypti. From the name, you may guess that it's an African mosquito, which is now spread all over the world. And this is a mosquito that bites aggressively, both during the day and the evening. Lots of people think of mosquitoes as biting more in the evening hours, but unfortunately, Aedes is a day biter, and it's also the mosquito that spreads chikungunya and dengue. We know that Aedes aegypti has a range that covers nearly all of Latin America and the Caribbean. It also covers the southern United States. It's a really mean mosquito. It lives indoors, not just outdoors. It likes to live with people, and it likes to snack on people. It takes blood sips, not just blood meals, so it can bite multiple people in the course of satisfying its need for a blood meal. We have never found Aedes aegypti here in New York City, and we've been studying mosquitoes here for a long time, but we do have a related mosquitoes. The entomologists hate that we call it the cousin mosquito, but that's what we call it. And it's called Aedes albopictus. Its common name is the Asian tiger mosquito, and it does live and bite here in New York City. And our laboratory test suggests that it can carry the Zika virus, but we have never found Zika in this mosquito in New York City, and we've been testing it this season. We know also that albopictus can be a vector for dengue and chikungunya, but neither dengue nor chikungunya have ever been transmitted here, even though we had hundreds of cases of imported chikungunya during the height of the Caribbean outbreak 2 years ago. And albopictus is also a day biter, but it likes wooded areas. It's less likely to take up residence in people's homes. By the time the Zika was declared a public health issue of international concern, everyone was scouring the literature for the experiences in other places where there had been outbreaks, in the Yap Islands in the Pacific and French Polynesia, and researchers descended on Brazil, particularly to try and better understand what was being reported as a 5-fold increase in the number of babies born with microcephaly, which is babies born with very small heads. Now, as you've heard, I've lived still the better portion of my working life in a developing country, so I happen to know a fair number of Brazilian researchers. I know that they have outstanding epidemiologists, so I was never skeptical of the information coming out of Brazil. I believed what we were hearing, and we learned a lot, and we knew a lot come January of this year. We knew from YAP that about 80% of people who get infected with this virus are asymptomatic. That means that they don't have any symptoms at all and wouldn't know that they'd been infected unless they had a test for an antibody response. The typical symptoms are notably rash. That's the most common symptom, even more common than fever, then red eyes, joint pain. It's, for most people, an unpleasant but not very serious condition. People don't die of Zika infection. But it does have an association with Guillain-Barré, which is a rare complication of a whole host of infections. That can be life-threatening. It's a form of paralysis, but it's quite rare. We reckon that there's a case of Guillain-Barré for every 5,000 to 10,000 Zika infections. So the biggest concern was from Brazil. With the babies with microcephaly, and it's now agreed that Zika infection in pregnancy causes microcephaly. But there are a whole host of adverse pregnancy outcomes associated with Zika. There's not any time during pregnancy when it's safe to acquire Zika infection, and we still don't know how big that risk is. We're going to find out. The studies are underway. But right now, to a woman who's pregnant and Zika infected, we can only offer her the facts that the risk of microcephaly varies from 1 to 13%. That's an unhelpful 10-fold difference in risk that we have to convey to women, and that the number of adverse outcomes can be over a quarter of women who, including fetal death for women infected in their 3rd trimester of pregnancy. We don't want women who are pregnant to get Zika infection. Here in New York City, we don't have Zika transmission here, so the risk to them is from travel and through sexual transmission of their partners if their partners travel. So I've just gone on to mention to you that we do know, and we knew in January, that there were rare cases of sexual transmission of Zika. More have now been documented, including in our city, in our lab, the first case of female-to-male transmission of Zika, which frankly didn't surprise us. I don't know any sexually transmitted diseases that don't go in both directions, but we hadn't previously identified female to male, and like other sexually transmitted infections, it seems that female to male is less efficient. We have 5 cases of sexual transmission documented in the city, and one of them is a case of female to male transmission. So come February of this year, we knew we had at our doorstep in Latin America and the Caribbean a very strange virus that we were expecting to show up in our city, at least as imported cases, because this is a gateway city, it's a traveling city, 40% of our population is foreign-born, and we have very strong ties from our immigrant populations to both Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, New York City had a really good head start in confronting Zika because we could build on the infrastructure confronting the West Nile virus, which was described here in New York City in 1999, so that's over 15 years ago. To many of you in this room, I doubt that you ever worry much about West Nile. Am I right? And that's really good. And that is a tribute to our investment in fighting West Nile virus in the city and designing, testing, and implementing a public health infrastructure. We have this year detected West Nile virus in mosquitoes, as we do every year, but we've had no human cases. But we had this infrastructure that we could build on to tackle Zika. And we identified back in February, announced this in April, 3 main buckets of activities. We wanted to reduce mosquitoes, push down the population of mosquitoes, including this Aedes albopictus, the cousin mosquito. We wanted to be able to detect Zika, both in humans and in mosquito populations, and we knew we needed to disseminate information about Zika, get it out to both medical providers and the public. We began with a focus on mosquito control. We've now moved on to hammer on the need to avoid travel-associated infection in pregnant women and to avoid sexual transmission following on the travel of male partners. We doubled our efforts at mosquito control, and this included preventive activities, calling on the public to assist us with removing standing water. I often point out that this can form a reservoir for mosquito breeding. Aedes can breed in a bottle cap, so it's not just big bodies of water. People are urged to remove them from their backyards. We began doubling our larviciding. The larvae are the first stage after the egg hatches, and they're contained in water bodies, so we can target. We know where they are then, and we can target it. Our larviciding to water bodies, we've done this from the air. We've done all the catch basins all over the city, tens of thousands of them. And of course, we called on the public to help us. More recently, we added adulticiding. So moving on from hatch worm-like stage of mosquitoes to the flying adult mosquito. And we have doubled the amount of spraying that we're doing in New York City. I live in Upper Manhattan, and 2:30 on, I guess that was Thursday morning, felt like Wednesday night, but I was standing at my doorway when the trucks came down my street. I think it's the first time in many, many years that we've seen spraying on the streets of Upper Manhattan. They come with a fogger, and we've doubled the amount that we're doing. All of this is evidence-based. It's driven by our trap findings, and we're doing something that we haven't done before, which we're not doing with West Nile. We're just trying to kill Aedes mosquitoes. We don't have any evidence that they have Zika in them, and we're reasonably optimistic that we won't find that evidence, but we are trying to push down an adult vector, a potential vector, without evidence that it is yet a public health threat. Now, in addition to our building on our infrastructure for West Nile virus, the Health Department uses the strategy that many agencies use across the country, and that is called an incident command system. We call it, for short, ICS. And when we activate in response to a threat, we develop sort of a SWAT team to tackle that public health threat. We transform our resources, our roles, our organizational structure to meet the needs of a developing incident. And we activated our incident command structure on February 1st of 2016. That was even a little ahead of the World Health Organization's declaration. And we have 4 areas. This is going to start to sound a little nerdy: surveillance, laboratory testing, public and provider outreach, mosquito control, clinical interventions. And each of these, we have a robust staffing, leadership support. All of our ICS positions have pre-identified, pre-trained, pre-assigned staff. We follow an on-call rotation with specific staff being assigned and deployed. Our response is capable of being scaled up or down depending on the specific needs of any emergency. And for those of you who are familiar with working in large organizations and know how hulking and slow large organizations can be, the adoption of the incident command system is truly a wonder. It's really sublime feat in planning. They meet every morning or every other morning and discuss the activities across all those groups. So our response has been tethered to 4 different scenarios. We began in February. Mosquito season in New York is April through October. So we were pre-mosquito season with no local transmission. Then the next scenario 2, is local transmission in the continental U.S., but not in New York City. And then our third scenario is we find Zika in mosquitoes in New York City. And the fourth is identifying local transmission to humans in the city. So I'm pleased to say that we continue to find no mosquitoes in New York City that test positive for Zika, no human cases that are related to mosquito-borne local transmission of Zika in the cities, but there is, as you've heard, active local transmission in the continental U.S. So we're firmly in scenario 2, and we have our response tailored accordingly. So what does this look like on the ground? How do we actually make this work? Well, we aren't only depending on health department staff. One of our best resources for Zika surveillance is a dense network of community physicians and healthcare providers who practice all across the city, who encounter patients every day. We work with 25,000 providers. We issue health alerts to them. I've lost count of how many we've issued about Zika to the clinical providers in the city. We tell them about how to get tests done, how we send them travel advisory posters to put up in their practices. And with Zika, we began working with a set of clinicians with whom we hadn't worked that much before, obstetricians and gynecologists, midwives, as well as pediatricians, family physicians, internists. And they are our first line. It is in many ways sort of a feedback loop. We train healthcare providers, and then they provide information back to us. We rely on astute physicians. For example, that case of female-to-male transmission of Zika, we identified because an astute clinician who saw symptoms in a man whose partner had traveled recently and who notified us that he was concerned that this might be a case of sexual transmission of Zika. So we have this feedback loop. We also use our data from human surveillance, that's from testing people for Zika, from mosquito surveillance, from our traps, which we've doubled in number all over the city. We put this information together, and that allows us to direct additional resources for testing and control in the areas that we need them most. We, for example, were tracking where we were seeing people being tested for Zika. And in February, almost all of the testing was being done below 96th Street. Now, it might be that everybody under 96th Street gets to go to the Caribbean in February, but we know that there are big parts of the city where there are people with strong ties to the Caribbean, and we just felt we weren't seeing enough tests coming from those communities. We were concerned that maybe the testing wasn't being offered or done. So we reached out and began seeking to address that disparity in anticipated testing rates in neighborhoods that we considered immigrant or strong ties to Latin America and the Caribbean neighborhoods. And I'm happy to say that we've, as a result of those efforts, seen that disparity in testing disappear. In fact, we're seeing more testing done in the areas where we would expect to see more testing, and no longer seeing this disparate number of cases coming from lower Manhattan. Now, when I talk about testing, and I talked with somebody as we were getting started this morning about this, I can't pass up on the opportunity to talk about our public health laboratory. Many of you may not know that New York City's health department runs a world-class public health lab. In February, that lab didn't test for Zika. In fact, there were hardly any labs in the entire country that tested for Zika. There were no commercial tests. And our lab was able to staff up to adopt and master the testing techniques. And we now have tested 6,500 individuals. We're up to testing nearly about 100 people a day for Zika. So our public health lab has been an enormous resource. It did this for us during Ebola. It did this for us during Legionnaires. And for some of you who keep track of the newspapers, you may have read about our lab director, Jen Rakeman, who was profiled in the Wall Street Journal as the Zika warrior. Now, she's a very soft-spoken person, so I don't know whether she would have described herself as a Zika warrior, but I can't imagine anybody better at leading the charge and getting our lab ready to test both mosquitoes and people for Zika. So if there's a mosquito infected with Zika in New York City, this is how we'd know. We every day have traps placed all over the city, and we go out and bring these traps to the lab. Our entomologists count them. So if we start seeing the numbers going up, we know that. And then they mash them up and test them for Zika. And then we dispatch our trucks with the foggers mounted on the back, or sometimes in places where we want to get spraying done where the trucks can't reach, we have people going out with appropriate protective gear, wearing backpacks and fogging from backpacks. And we even have done, not for adulticiding, but for larviciding, aerial spraying. Now, our West Nile virus system gives us 15 years worth of data on where the mosquito habitats are in the city, so we drew on that, but we didn't know that much about Aedes, so we've added to that. And we have developed a statistical index. We have all sorts of modeling going on behind the scenes, which the public doesn't see, that directs us on where we're seeing cases, where we're seeing mosquitoes, and where we need to direct our mosquito control efforts. So this is not something that the public sees that much, but it really is a bedrock of how we are controlling Zika. Now, to get the word out to the public, and we use traditional forms of communication. We have press conferences. We get the mayor to come, who always brings cameras with him, to come and announce our efforts, and he's been hugely supportive. The reason we're able to do all these things is because we have the resources to do it, and those resources were allocated in the form of $21 million over the next 3 years. We do talk shows. We talk, on various outlets, both television and radio. And we do ad campaigns on the subways. We're started out with the Fight Back campaign about mosquito control, and we're now moving on to emphasizing guidance to pregnant women and their partners. But we know that media and ad campaigns are only part of what we need to do. We reach out to elected officials, to community boards. We have held town halls. We work with faith-based institutions, civic organizations, and our community affairs units goes out and has done scores of local presentations that are tailored to meet local needs. So we're learning. As you've heard, the most serious and most relevant risk is to pregnant women and their developing fetuses. And the challenge is and will remain to protect her. But we need this to be a shared responsibility. So in a focus group, it came out that inadvertently we were shifting responsibility to the pregnant woman when in fact it needed to be shared. As an example, a woman who is being told to advise her partner to use condoms when he comes back from traveling to a area where there's Zika transmission understandably may feel that she's being asked to sort of imply that her partner's been unfaithful to her, even though she wants him to use condoms to protect her pregnancy. So we don't want that woman to have that responsibility. This is a responsibility for the men as well as the women. So we shifted our messaging to directly call upon male partners to limit their risk of transmitting Zika to their pregnant partners, and to use the overall key message as protecting your baby. So I've also been pestering my team to develop a message for pregnant women in the voice of a beloved family member back home in an area where Zika transmission is ongoing. And I want to have that grandmother or aunt say, this year I don't want to see you. Don't come. Come later. Come when you have that baby. So we are learning how to get the message across, and I am so alarmed at the number of pregnant women who we've tested. We're now up to about 3,500 women who are Zika exposed, who've been tested in our lab. As I mentioned, 49 of them have tested positive, but 3,500 pregnant women have presented to their doctors, reported what's usually travel-associated exposure. Sometimes it's sexual exposure. That's just under 15% of the time. I said, at the rate we're going, it's going to be just a matter of time till we have a case of microcephaly, and we did have our first case of a baby born with Zika-related microcephaly here in New York City. We thought we'll hold back on talking about a single case. We'll wait till we have several. We take protecting privacy very seriously. But it's so important that people understand that this is real, that we decided to announce that case, stripping it of any identifiers. One thing that I've really learned as Health Commissioner, even though we love data, even though we're creating models based on mosquito trap data and travel patterns of communities and the number of Zika cases, what people respond to, what we all respond to, are stories. And we have to get the stories out there. So sounds like we've been doing a lot. We have really had every part of our health department engaged in the response, and as I've pointed out, we've had really high levels of political support for this response. We're spending about $3 million a year on mosquito control. That's a pretty big chunk of the $21 million that we have over the 3 years in city funding. So I'd like to shift a little bit. I really wanted to spend some time ranting about how upset I am about the lack of federal action. We can do these things because we have a city government that has the capacity and the political will to spend money on Zika, but not everyone has that. And certainly Puerto Rico, we know, does not have that capacity. And New Yorkers have a special bond to Puerto Rico, a historical bond, but these are U.S. citizens, and it just horrifies me that they are in the grips of such a severe Zika outbreak without federal action. We, in solidarity, sent 1 million condoms. We have another 1 million on the way, but we need federal action on this. But I did promise to say a few things about what keeps me up at night, so I'm going to spend a little time talking about that. We are close to 500 cases of Zika diagnosed here in New York City. This is about a quarter of the number of cases that have been identified nationally. And as I said, nearly 50 are in women. Overwhelmingly, infection is acquired in these women by travel. All of our cases are travel-related, including the 5 cases of sexual transmission. One of the primary partner acquired Zika infection related to being in a Zika-affected area and then sexually transmitted that infection. We've had no onward chains of transmission that we've identified here or, to my knowledge, anywhere. So what keeps me up is thinking about why are pregnant women still traveling? Why have we successfully conveyed the risks? Every day we have more women who've presented themselves and been approved by our call center for testing. And, we tell people that they should not engage in any non-essential travel. But for me, and this may represent a value judgment, it's really hard for me to understand what essential travel is for a pregnant woman who may be placing her unborn baby at risk of birth defects. I'm also, of course, thinking about sexual transmission, and we have 5 cases identified here in the city. We don't know for sure how people who have travel-associated infection got infected. They may have been infected sexually by being in a Zika-affected area. But we think overwhelmingly the way people acquire Zika is through mosquitoes. But, it's been pointed out that in Brazil, which has a very large outbreak, there may be a sexual epidemic that's hidden inside the mosquito-borne epidemic. We know, at least we are guessing, that male to female and sexual transmission is more efficient, and we have a female predominance of cases, so maybe that is part of an untold story of sexual transmission in Brazil. So I've looked at our data. I've looked at 500 cases, 5 of them sexual transmission, all of them travel associated, and I've decided that we're going to focus on getting the message out about don't travel if you're pregnant or trying to get pregnant to an area where there's Zika. But when we say, trying to get pregnant, and the reason we say that is because women don't know the instant that they become pregnant. In fact, we know that a large number of women didn't know till they got back that they were pregnant. So really what we're saying is if you're sexually active and fertile and not using effective contraception, you're trying to get pregnant, even if you're not thinking about it like that. And so I think about, are we, should we be hammering harder on the fact, and here in New York City we can talk about this, that women who are traveling to Zika-affected areas or whose partners have traveled, who may be exposed through sexual transmission, need to use effective contraception if they're not trying to get pregnant. And here in New York City, we have decades of commitment to choice for women, and we can talk about that. Should we be talking about it more? And last, I want to just take a step back and talk about the big picture, which we should never lose track of, even as we fix our collective gaze on microbes. When I started as health commissioner, I made it one of my priorities to acknowledge the long-standing ties between the pursuit of the people's health and our efforts to advance social justice. So this, for me, speaks to my responsibility to talk about the persistent harms of racism, poverty, all forms of oppression, speaking out using my position to legitimize these conversations within our own agency, across our city, talking about the importance of raising our voices about injustices. And it's been reflected in my priorities, whether it's talking about health inequities in our data as we report them, or establishing for the first time a center for health equity at our health department. So when we think about Zika, we should ask ourselves the question, why did we find so many cases of microcephaly in northeast Brazil? And the answer isn't that the Brazilians are somehow physiologically more at risk for Zika. Their physiology is no different than ours. What is different is the circumstances of their lives. Diseases don't discriminate. All of us are at risk for Zika, but we have varied settings in which that risk can be moderated. And poverty creates multitudes of situations in which people can be more exposed. The favelas lack all sorts of 19th century public health infrastructure, and that increases their risk of Zika, just like Ebola exposed the real underbelly of African urbanization. Zika exposes the same fissures that exist across our world, poverty and lack of rights is hampering our response because you need basic social protections to respond to disease outbreaks. You need safe, affordable, destigmatized access to birth control, including barrier methods and also effective long-term birth control. If you want to reduce unplanned pregnancy and sexual transmission, you need refuse collection, you need clean outdoor spaces, you need road systems that are drained. If you're going to tell people put up window screens, they have to live in a place where there are windows. And in many settings, that advice is irrelevant. And of course, it's not sensible to tell a pregnant woman stay indoors when we know that Aedes aegypti loves to take up residence inside houses. So we don't have to tackle poverty in order to tackle Zika, but we shouldn't stop talking about the ways in which poverty has and the inequalities within our country and across the world have increased our vulnerability. I've gone on at length about all the tools that we have in our toolbox here in New York City, and that has been made possible by resources and political support. There's an example, not of Zika, but of dengue, which is a related mosquito-borne disease, at the Texas-Mexico border. It's really a tale of two cities. On one side is Brownsville, Texas. On the other side is Matamoros in Mexico. The mosquitoes don't know about that border. The mosquitoes were going everywhere. But people in Matamoros were living with inconsistent access to water, so they kept, bodies of water around the house, so there was standing water. They had a much denser population. They lacked air conditioning, screened windows. So anyone want to guess what the difference was in dengue in Brownsville and in Matamoros? It was an 8-fold difference in the occurrence of cases. So that's obviously not acceptable. And we found these sorts of variability in infectious disease tracking with poverty across our city. Our epidemiologists have shown that New Yorkers who live in high poverty areas are more likely to be diagnosed with 21 of 38 infectious diseases that we identified. These included malaria, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV, TB. Some of these are diseases that you've come to associate with poverty, but not all of them. And all of them are diseases to which we are all vulnerable. So that is really where I want to end so that we have some time for questions. But I think that the fact is that when we have outbreaks, it gets us to get together across professions, as we are this morning, for all of us across our many types of work and areas of expertise. We all come together under this tent of a disease response, in this case to Zika. But I think we need to think that the answer is a much broader tent and includes affordable housing, minimum wage, paid family leave. All of these are also ways that we protect the public's health, not just the particular efforts we make to target one disease. Thank you all. I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you. We've never had a more important talk than this, and I really appreciate it. Before we take questions and their microphones here, I asked the people who would come to the microphone. I'd like to recognize Assemblyman Richard Gottfried, Chair of the Assembly Health Committee. He is the longest-serving member of the Assembly, represents Midtown West, and is a friend of long standing, and we really thank you for being here. And if I offer a first opportunity to comment, if you would like on anything that you'd like to say. Go to the microphone, please. And
Thank you. I should have recognized him.
And others, please follow. This is an open opportunity to ask questions. Very important topics have been raised, and we welcome short comments and good questions.
Well, first of all, I guess a quick comment. I think your talk this morning was a really good reminder, number one, of the enormous importance, life and death importance of a strong public health infrastructure. And number two, the fact that as residents of New York City, we should be very grateful that for, 150 years now, we have been really the premier public health infrastructure place on the planet. And that's I guess, big shoes to be walking in, but fortunately, you and your predecessors have really done a terrific job of that. About 10 or 15 years ago, the CDC organized an effort to study public health emergency preparedness laws in this country and came out with a model statute. And when I read it, my sense was, gee, we have almost all of that on the books here in New York. That's pretty reassuring. And so I, to a room full of lawyers, do you think New York's legal infrastructure for supporting public health, whether emergencies or day-to-day things, is strong enough, and is the department looking at things that maybe should be changed?
Thanks, Dick, for that question. The first thing to say is that people may not know it, but one of the things that we have at the New York City Health Department is police powers. We have, through our Board of Health, which is appointed by the mayor and ratified by the City Council, oversee something called the Health Code, which has legal authority. And so we have a lot more power than many local health authorities. That probably accounts for some of the successes that we've had. We haven't thought of everything, though. For example, last summer, everybody remembers the Legionnaires outbreak, and we did go to the City Council, and they passed a law on enhancing our regulation of cooling towers, for example. But we always have the possibility of commissioner's orders that can, in a case of an emergency, order a response. So I think that our legal envelope is pretty strong. And not only do we have the legal structure that we need, but we have a lot of the organizational structures. I emphasize a lot that we didn't come to Zika unprepared. We had a strong infrastructure from West Nile virus and a very strong health department. I really should flatter our department more, because it is, in fact, the strongest urban health department in the country, I would argue probably in the world. So at the moment, we always are sort of coming up with ideas for our health code and ways in which we can strengthen the protection of New Yorkers. But in terms of disease response, we're in pretty good shape. We're in pretty good shape.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On this side, do you want to?
As a former Boy Scout who used to camp in the upper woods, the woods of Michigan, is there any value in skin-applied insect repellents?
Oh yes, I actually have my travel insect repellent in my bag, which I normally bring to the podium. But yes, skin repellents work. They work if they have one of 4 chemical constituents that the Centers for Disease Control recommends, and those are DEET, which you've probably all heard of, Picardin, which is in Skin So Soft, or lemon oil of eucalyptus, which I confess is what I use, and also something called IR 3535. So not all mosquito repellents work. And sadly, whenever there's something comes along like Zika, there are shysters who get out there and start marketing fake products, which I was recently with Eric Schneiderman talking about some of these fake products. But if you use one of insect repellent with one of these, they work. We recommend that you apply them. The thing that people often don't know, that I should just take the opportunity to point out, is that mosquito repellent should be the last thing that you put on your skin. So after the sunscreen, all that, put the repellent on last. Obviously, that's because you want it to be the first thing that the mosquito encounters when it comes near your skin. Use mosquito repellent carry it with you and apply it throughout the day. Former Boy Scout. Who's next?
prepared.
Okay.
Hello, Dr. Bassett. Thank you very much. I have to admit, I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually an infectious disease doctor, an epidemiologist at NYU and Bellevue, where a lot of your positive Zika tests have come from. I have two questions, if you don't mind. Number one has to do with the travel advisories. I realize they're sort of political decisions, but can you maybe comment on the discrepancy between a travel advisory for the entire country of Mexico versus the 1 mile area in Miami? Which is now, as you said, mosquitoes cross borders. And secondly, can you comment on recent reports of Culex mosquitoes carrying Zika, which we've heard from Brazil? Thank you.
Sure. So that's two questions. The first, I should point out that in making the advisory for the Wentwood neighborhood, which accounts for the vast majority of Miami cases, but not all of them, the CDC departed from a long-standing tradition of never issuing travel advisories for the domestic the continental United States. So I want to acknowledge that I'm sure behind the scenes took a lot of negotiation and considerable political courage to say that we must do this. And I think the reason is because what we're talking about here is protecting babies. And everyone agrees that is a crucial responsibility of any society. Now, we all have to watch. I understand that there are 2 cases now from Miami Beach. I would predict that the area will expand. And I agree with you that it is inconsistent, but I think that we have come a long way in being willing to issue a travel advisory for the continental United States. Now, the next question was about Culex mosquitoes. Now, this is the vector for West Nile virus, is a Culex mosquito, and there have been some concerns that Aedes isn't the only vector, that there are other mosquitoes. We've looked at this. We don't think that it's a source of concern. We are focused on Aedes here in New York City. And so we are continuing to test our Aedes mosquito pools for Zika. Okay, on this side. Hi.
Thanks, Dr. Bassett. I wanted to ask, in the bluntest way possible, if this is going to get worse before it gets better, in light of essentially what we don't yet know about Zika. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't know how long it stays in someone's body. And then there was a study yesterday that pointed to the potential of brain damage in adults with Zika, and I was just curious, in light of those things and others, how much worse, even with federal funding, this epidemic could get. Thank you.
Sure. So in terms of geographic spread, I think that the continued geographic spread in the continental United States is one that we should anticipate. Not only Florida is at risk, also the whole Gulf region. So I know that they're stepping up mosquito control efforts. To be frank, our experience with malaria and many other mosquito-borne diseases suggests that it's really difficult to control mosquitoes. So the next question is about what do we know about Zika, and do we have a full understanding of the range of possible effects? We know that there is persistence of Zika virus in what some people call immune privileged sites. And among those sites are the testes, so there's persistence of Zika and semen. That's why we have such a long period in which we recommend abstinence for anyone who travels from a Zika-affected area back to the United States, or the use of barrier methods. And for men with symptomatic Zika, we recommend 6 months. So that's 180 days. The longest I've seen is something like 150 days of persistence. We're enrolling, and New York City's been doing really well, and New Yorkers stepping up to enroll in a semen persistence study that the CDC is doing, and so we're just waiting for more information. I'm frankly concerned that there may be more long-term effects for babies born to Zika-infected women than what we see at birth. But we'll have, time will tell. Certainly with Ebola, we found out that there were more enduring effects. But The key, really, for most of us to remember is that Zika infection seems to be a mild disease in the majority of people who get it. And the person that we have to worry about is the woman who's pregnant because of the catastrophic impact of Zika infection on developing baby. So I think we know the big picture already. There may be added rarer outcomes, but we know the big picture, and that's bad enough.
These will be the last two questions.
Yeah, we promised to end on the dot at 9:30.
So I had a related question and a follow-up. In women who, for example, get infected in a Caribbean locale, are you beginning to collect data on how long the virus could persist in a woman who then becomes pregnant, say, much
We
later?
recommend that a woman wait 4 weeks after return before trying to get pregnant.
And the second is, I run a bar association. I'm sorry.
These are all based on the best available information we have about the persistence of Zika.
Okay.
For sexual transmission, we recommend 8 weeks for both men and women before having unprotected sex. So actually, come to think of it, it should be 8 weeks before you try to get
Okay.
pregnant.
Okay.
How can
And,
you? Yeah,
I
that's
have-
been extended. Yes.
Oh, okay. And
Bullet that.
And this is a storytelling kind of question. I run a bar association of judges and lawyers, and we have contracted for a week-long conference in the Dominican Republic in February. We have the opportunity to cancel that trip in the next week, and we're looking at the California desert as a that's true.
Well, I don't know how many. I mean, if you're concerned about not posing to your members who are women who are pregnant or trying to get pregnant, the decision that they shouldn't travel, which they shouldn't, or to men who are your members who are maybe thinking about starting a family and have to think about whether they can adhere to our advice, 8
Right.
weeks.
I think we're going to Palm Springs.
So you may go to Palm Springs. Is this the last question? All right, thank you.
Thank you for being here. My question to you is two-pronged. The first part of it is the first question that I had that arose in my mind when you were talking about all the different maladies that come transmitted through mosquito bites. And you were saying, do they snack or do they, make a meal out of you? My question is, what kind of is Zika and all the other maladies that you talked about, do they require extensive meal out of you by a mosquito, or is it just
actually a pretty good
very quickly?
question.
And
Thank
the
you.
second part of the two-pronged question is, let's say I decided to go to Rio and I touch down on a plane and I get out and I think my grandmother says it's because I'm very sweet, but I attract mosquitoes like crazy. So I get mosquito bite within, I don't know, half an hour of being there. That's it. If that mosquito was carrying something like Zika or some of the other maladies that you were talking about, is it as simple as just getting bitten
Okay.
once and that's it, or is it like, do you have to have a prolonged kind of exposure to it? Thank
Sure.
you.
Okay, those are good questions and ones that I'll try and answer quickly. One is that for a mosquito to become, not just ingest Zika, but become capable of transmitting it, they have to digest that blood meal and they have to have the virus multiply in their salivary glands, and then when they bite, they can transmit Zika. That doesn't happen instantly. That's why the time between taking in the blood and the mosquito becoming infectious to others, to humans, is typically about a week, sometimes more. So we have that time to try and kill that mosquito. Because it's not yet infectious, even though it's ingested a virus. Now, it also takes time between when you're bitten and when you become symptomatic. That is also something like a week. But in that time, a single bite can successfully transmit the virus. That's why we talk about the sipping is a problem, because they can, if it's an infected Zika mosquito, it snacks on multiple people. It doesn't just bite one and go home and rest and digest. So that's why that sort of pattern is a problem. So one bite can be enough. That's why we recommend that you use lather on the insect repellent and avoid mosquito bites as a general recommendation. They're unpleasant. I have some on my elbow today. They're very unpleasant, and there's no Zika. I'm not worried about Zika. So use repellent, but one bite can be enough, sadly. All right, thanks everybody. It was a real pleasure.
Please stay just for a minute.
Sure.
Well, this is, as I said, this is really one of the most important breakfasts we ever had, and I thank you all. I particularly thank Dr. Bassett for a really full explanation of where we are in the city. As we always do, we like to give to our speakers a product of the scholarship of New York Law School, and I hope you're doing more than reading at night. I hope you're working on the. But I wanted to give you a very special issue, 2-volume issue of our law review on Africa, South Africa. The Constitution involves some of the health care, and then the most recent publication of our Impact Center deals with a lot of the poverty issues that relate to the health issues. And we give it to you with
thank
great
you.
appreciation for a very stimulating morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will see you in September when Correction Commissioner Pont will be here.